Welcome. Welcome to our live webcast from the Anshe Sfar Bethel Emeth congregation here in Memphis, Tennessee. Thanks for joining us today. Today our topic is perspective. Gaining perspective through the Pesach Hagadah. But first I'd like to begin with a few questions. The Gemara, the Talmud says in Pesachim 116a, Kuftet Zayin Amud Aleph, that the Mishnah says, Matchil b'gnut u'mesayim b'shvach, that we begin the Haggadah, telling the story of the Exodus, with something derogatory. U'mesayim b'shvach. And we complete and conclude the Haggadah with something praiseworthy, something good, something which leads to praise of God. Question is, what does the Mishnah mean? The Talmud says, My bignut, what is this derogatory thing we should begin with? Two opinions in the Talmud. Rav, one of the early sages of the Gemara, says, And at first, our ancestors were great worshippers of idols. Shmuel said, Avadim hayinu. Shmuel said, let's begin the story with the derogatory point that we, the Jewish people, used to be slaves in Egypt. Question on this is, why is it important to begin the story with something derogatory? Why not just tell the story? We went out of Egypt, the Exodus. Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. Tell everyone that we went out of Egypt. Why do we have to start with something derogatory? And if we are going to start with something derogatory, what's the difference? Why begin with the notion that we used to be slaves, the notion that we used to be idolaters? What's the significance of these different beginnings that there are to the story of the Pesach story? And why must it have this development from the derogatory to the positive? And then we have the story of Reb Nachman. Reb Nachman was a rabbi in the Talmud. He had a servant, and he said to Daro, his servant, Avda de mapik le mare lecherut v'yai kaspo dahava, my baila memrle, a slave whose master let him go into freedom, and he gave him gold and silver as a going away present. What should the slave say to the master? Amar le, the servant said to Reb Nachman, Bari lo duye l'shabuche. He needs to praise him. And the Reb Nachman answered, Patratam milomar manishtana. If so, you've exempted me from saying manishtana. What do we mean? Why did an exchange between a servant and his master about what a slave would need to do if they went free, why does that exempt him from saying manishtana? What is it about manishtana? About how is this night different from other nights? How does this discussion solve the problem of the need for a child to ask a question and the father to give an answer? So let's begin with the first question. Why are there so many versions? Why are there so many versions of the Haggadah, of telling the story? There are actually four. Not only are there 4 cups, 4 sons, 4 questions, but there are also 4 stories in the Haggadah. I'd like to suggest that each one of these stories gives a different perspective on where we are today. One story is Arami Oved Avi. My father, my ancestor Abraham, was a wandering Aramean. Or perhaps Jacob was a wandering Aramean. Perhaps the idea that Laban tried to destroy, Laban was an Aramean, and he tried to destroy my forefather. What perspective does this give me? By telling the story in this particular way, starting with Laban, concluding with the Exodus, how does that change the story? And the answer is, it gives me a certain perspective. The perspective is, I not only went out of Egypt, I not only saw great miracles from God, I not only came to the land of Israel, but not only that, but where did I come from? I came from a point in my history where I almost didn't exist. Laban tried to destroy the entire family. He tried to claim the whole family as his and steal the whole family from Yaakov and claim they were his servants. Leah and Rachel were all his maidservants. Laban tried to destroy everything. What we're saying is that if we don't realize this perspective, that yes, we have an Exodus, but how much greater is the Exodus in perspective of in the view of the fact that we almost were utterly destroyed. That is the perspective that beginning with Laban helps us gain a perspective of our near annihilation. Second story, second version, which we tell in the Haggadah, beginning with the derogatory. The version of Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Avotenu. At first, our ancestors were idol worshippers. The religious perspective. Yes, today we worship God. We take it for granted. We're born as Jews. That's the way it is. We have Pesach. We have Passover. That's what it is. But it wasn't always that way. Appreciating the fact that once upon a time we were lost in that pagan confusion with all the rest of them. That's the perspective that the story can give us. A third version, Avadim Hayinu. We were slaves, and now we went free. It's not just that we are free. We are free. That's the way we live. We live in America. We are free individuals. But that we once weren't. That's the perspective. Rabbi Soloveitchik explains that the notion of freedom means that when I was a slave, I had to be very respectful. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. Whatever the master says, that's what I agree to. But now I have choices, and I have the right to ask and even be disrespectful and to ask questions and challenge. That's why we have questions. That's what it means to be free. But if we don't realize what it meant to be a slave, we don't understand what it means to be free. The contrast gives us perspective. Understanding where we are today, where the Exodus was, in relationship with that which came before, gives us new perspective. There's a fourth story hiding in the Haggadah as well, where we simply mention that in the covenant of the parts, the Brit Bein Abtarim, God said to Abraham that your children will be slaves in a land that's not theirs, and they will work for them, and they will be slaves for 400 years, and then they will go out with great wealth. The perspective of going from slavery, which represents poverty, and going to the position of great wealth. This is another perspective. That our freedom today has enabled us to live not only as free individuals, but also to have great wealth, for which we are thankful. And that answers the question of what Reb Nachman was getting at with his servant. If you could gain the perspective that a slave would surely have to thank God for going free and for giving him gold and silver, then we too should be thankful to God for everything that we have. But it's only by gaining perspective, by looking back into our past, perhaps our immigrant past, our European past, where Jews sometimes live with great poverty. Perhaps looking at the more recent history in Europe, where Jews were almost annihilated. Perhaps looking at our not so distant past, where Jews were not free and did not have their own independent country. Perhaps looking at our own personal histories, where we didn't always have it as well off as we do today. Perspective. And the Haggadah begins with perspective. It's a different perspective. Perspective that says, Hashata Hacha. Now we say in the Halach Ma'anya, the opening prayer of the Haggadah, we're here. But L'shana Haba'a B'nei Chorin. Next year we'll be somewhere else. This is not the end of the story. That's the perspective. A historical perspective that looks back and says, where am I today in relation to where I used to be? That gains one perspective. And where am I today in relationship to where I will be? That's the second perspective, equally important. It reminds us of the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. The Mishnah, Talmudic passage in the Ethics of the Fathers says, Histakel b'shlosha dvarim. Look at three things and you'll never come to sin. Da me'ayin bata. Where do you come from? We come from humble beginnings. We were just a thought in our parents' eyes. We were just a seed. And wa'ana taholech. And where are you going? What's the future? One day we'll no longer be here. One day our body will rest in the earth. That's perspective.